Hello, my name is Tom, and I am a real big fan of David Bentley Hart. I've listened to a lot of his YouTube recordings. I have read a couple of his books, working on one of his novels now, and believe he has some vital things to say to Christians. So I'm going to work on doing a condensed version or an overview of his book, That All Shall Be Saved, Heaven, Hell, and Universal Salvation. And as I start it, I'm going to recite the story of an ancient Christian monk that I will refer to at the end of this first video, which is basically just the introduction to his book. Because I think it kind of sets the stage for the kind of thing that Hart is talking about debunking, which is the idea of hell. So here we go. This is the story of Saint Macarius the Great. He's a 4th century Christian monk, and one day while walking in the desert, he found the skull of a dead man. When he moved it with his stick, the skull spoke to him. St. Macarius asked the skull who it was, and the skull replied that it was the high priest of idols and pagans who once lived in that place. And the skull recognized St. Macarius as a spirit bearer. The skull then revealed that whenever St. Macarius prayed for those in torment, they felt a little respite. And the skull described the torment as standing in fire from head to foot, with faces fixed to the backs of others. But when St. Macarius prayed for them, they could see each other's faces a little. And St. Macarius asked if there were punishments more painful than this, and the skull said there was a more grievous punishment below them. Those who knew God and denied him were suffering even more. And after this conversation, St. Macarius picked up the skull and buried it. And now we'll begin reviewing the introduction. Hello, I'm Tom. I'm coming to you from somewhere in Texas, near Houston. I'm here to talk to you as a non-academic, non-scholar, average person about David Bentley Hart's book, That All Shall Be Saved, Heaven and Hell, and Universal Salvation. Maybe someday I'll show you my face, but that's not important. Probably more important that you see my dogs that'll be making noise from time to time, probably. And people may be walking by. I'm doing this out on the porch in the morning. Hope to have several sessions. This is the introduction to the book, so let's get started. So, Hart defines Christian Universalists as those who believe everyone will, in the final wrap-up of all things, be saved. There have been some notable Christian thinkers who believed this from the very early centuries of Christianity. These Universalists were most numerous in the first 500 years of the faith. So again, we're just going through the introduction in this session. Universalists were accepted as part of the family and not considered odd or unusual, as they have come to be regarded in the western part of Christendom. Hell to these Universalist Christians was thought of as fires of purification that burn away all that doesn't belong within a being created in the image of a loving Creator. They may have even been in the majority in some places, particularly in the eastern Greek-speaking regions. This Universalist sentiment dwindled away to the margins through these centuries. for reasons to be detailed later in the book. But in the 19th century, the tide began to turn back toward the Universalist beliefs to some extent. Hart's stated purpose in his introduction is to peel back the layers of later theology and look at the beliefs and conceptions of those much closer to the beginnings of the Christian faith regarding universalism. Get back to the time when early Christian writings were being sorted through and designated as part of the canon or not. Hart recommends the introduction and postscript of his translation of the New Testament as a companion to this current book because of footnotes it gives for verses used in this book, verses from the Bible. Hart believes that 2,000 years of dogmatic tradition have painted a misleading picture of what early Christians thought, and hopes to set the record straight with his Bible translation and this book. He says that there are enough ambiguities in the Greek of the New Testament writings to make early Christian readers very comfortable with the universalist view of things. Hart believes that for the Christian system of belief to be credible, coherent, the universalist telling of the story is the only one possible. He finds it curious to be writing a book so much at odds with the invincibly established opinions of the majority of Christians, and has low expectations of convincing many that his views are correct. He lays out the arguments against universalism in his introduction. There are 3 of those, and he says they are predictable and shop-worn. First, that this view of things contradicts the explicit language of Scripture, and he flatly says it does not. He notes that it was condemned as heretical, is an argument in the early centuries of the Church by the Fifth Ecumenical Council, and again he flatly states it was not. And he says that others make their arguments by trying to defend the ideas of an eternal hell with philosophical defenses. So the impetus or reason for this book is that in July of 2015, Hart made a Notre Dame lecture that is contained in the first meditation in this book. And that lecture started a lot of interest and discussion, both positive and negative, but did not contain the broader set of ideas for Hart's reasons for being an unapologetic universalist, and I would add somewhat militantly so. And then just jumping into part 1, just jumping into the head, the first chapter, beyond the introduction. So part 1 is the question of an eternal hell, and he quotes Alice Through the Looking Glass, Alice in Wonderland, about the queen believing impossible things, 6 of them before breakfast on some occasion. And first is framing the question. So Hart begins that by telling a story about a skull found along the path by a 4th century pious Christian with whom he had a discussion. So this pious Christian had a discussion with the skull about hell. And whoever wrote the story down definitely believed in a most horrid version of hell and those who inhabit it. So David Bentley Hart was 14 when he first heard this story, and a week later he heard an Episcopal priest preach a sermon on the story. And before the sermon's end, he realized that his reaction was quite the opposite of any intentions the priest had in mind. And Hart details them as follows. The pious guy in the story who prayed for lost souls was much more merciful than the God who sent them to hell. And number two, that the creator of such a hell would have to be viciously vindictive by nature. And that's where we'll begin or end this session.